Hey, so one of the most interesting political feuds we've seen here in Canada over the last few weeks has been Erin O'Toole, the new leader of the Conservative Party of Canada, trying really hard to make a name for himself, and spending the better part of the last few weeks hounding Prime Minister Justin Trudeau and his Liberal government on their, as he frames it, complete lack of a plan on a vaccine, putting Canada at the back of the line compared to other countries around the world. To then have JT snap back just a couple days later with all the details on a plan which appears to have stopped the nattering from the opposition for now. Health Canada approved Pfizer's COVID-19 vaccine, the same that's been rolled out in the United Kingdom and that the US FDA has just approved, and if all goes according to plan, UPS is currently shipping the first Canadian doses from Belgium to 14 sites across the country via Kentucky. It's abundantly clear that Canada's plan to procure vaccines proactively from the widest variety of companies was a strong move to get vaccines on the ground here quickly. We're easily one of the first handful of countries in the world to get their doses, number 3 after the UK if I'm not mistaken, even before the United States. And obviously we're not talking about vaccines for everybody here. It's only in the tens of thousands of doses for now, which have to be stored at an insane minus 70 degrees Celsius, so not all places in Canada will be able to store them, and each person needs 2 shots taken 3 weeks apart, so whatever doses Canada got, cut that number in half, and that's the actual number of people who can get vaccinated. But it's a start. But then there's Erin O'Toole, who had Canadians on the edge of their seat for weeks, believing that Canada had let them down, that we outsourced all of our capacity to make vaccines to other countries if we ever had any at all, and that the government failed to do their job because the vaccine companies would be doling out the doses to countries bit by bit, starting out with the countries that made them, Canada not being one of them. Despite once being one of, if not the world leader in vaccine development for the better part of the last century, we're sitting this pandemic out on the sidelines. I took a look back through the history of vaccine development in Canada, and I asked myself, what happened? Well, I don't think Mr. O'Toole is going to like the answer. Canada's history with vaccines is a long one, and much like most of scientific advancement, it's built on the small steps of discoveries of countless scientists over centuries. But it really took form over the last 100 or so years, and it's a story best told by introducing you to a Mr. John G. Fitzgerald. Born in Drayton, Ontario in the late 1880s, John was an incredibly intelligent young man. He was the son of a pharmacist and a mother who was terribly sick, which had a profound impact on John as a boy. He would see his mom sick and his dad trying mixtures and tinctures to make her and others around him better. No wonder the idea of wanting to help others out there came so naturally to him. At the time, Canada's healthcare system was nothing like it is today. It wasn't free, it wasn't universal, it was for the most part just local governments and religious groups offering whatever they could to help the urban poor in growing but filthy cities. This is where John Fitzgerald grew up, seeing the sick and desperate around him. He went off to medical school at only 16 years old, graduating as a psychiatrist in 1903. He worked as the chief pathologist at the Toronto Asylum for the Insane, but he really didn't feel like he was actually making a difference in the suffering that he saw around him. And so just a few years later, he left for Harvard University in Boston in his early 20s to study the new science of bacteriology. And in 1910, he married an heiress, Edna Leonard, before they went honeymooning in Europe, where he continued to study at the Pasteur Institute in Paris. The institute was producing groundbreaking science in the field of microbiology, understanding disease, and producing vaccines. Nothing like this was happening in Canada yet, and Fitzgerald was enthralled. He finally knew how he was going to make a difference and actually save lives. Canada was going through an ongoing epidemic of diphtheria, also known as the Strangler for its violent infection of the respiratory system. Diphtheria was the leading cause of death for kids under 14 at the time in Canada, and in Ontario alone, over 36,000 children died from the disease between 1880 and 1930. And there was an antitoxin, a vaccine that existed in the United States, and the wealthiest of patients could travel with their families overland to New York City if they could afford it. But that was not most Canadians. And John saw hundreds of young lives that could have been saved if only there was a way to make that vaccine cheaper and make it accessible for people. He came back to Toronto in 1913 and became an associate professor of hygiene at the University of Toronto. He proposed to the board of the university to found a Toronto wing of the Pasteur Institute, some sort of an institution for the study, development, production, and dissemination of life-saving vaccines to everyone in Canada. But they were skeptical at first, and they took their time to make a decision. John, however, was impatient. He saw kids dying in the city, and he knew that he could do something to make it better. So he took $3,000 from his wife's fortune, and he opened a barn on the outskirts of the city at 145 Barton Avenue, right where this Koreatown home is located today. In the barn, he worked to develop Canada's first locally made rabies vaccine, and when that proved successful, he turned towards the diphtheria antitoxin. The government of Ontario agreed to buy his antitoxin at cost and essentially distribute it for free across Ontario, and it worked. By 1914, the Antitoxin Laboratory was formally established in the Department of Hygiene. The lab operated by mass producing the vaccines and selling them at cost to the provinces, so there was no financial risk to the university. And Canadians would benefit from the free access to life-saving vials. What John Fitzgerald did back in 1914 set in motion the creation of Canada's universal public healthcare system. And although it would take another 50 years for us to get there, the idea that some things, especially access to healthcare, had to be accessible to everyone, no matter their ability to pay for it. That idea was planted right then and there. But that wasn't the end of the antitoxin lab, or Mr. Fitzgerald's story. Not even close. 1914 was the outset of the First World War. Canada had not a fraction of the necessary amount of tetanus antitoxin available for this new type of trench warfare with dirt and barbed wire and tanks and planes. The lab was quickly equipped with the capacity to start a Canadian production line of tetanus vaccines that was provided to members of the Canadian Expeditionary Force. In fact, the lab got so good at the tetanus vaccine that it was able to produce a surplus by 1916, and both Ontario and Saskatchewan purchased doses for the vaccine for people back home too. No more dying from stepping on a rusty nail at the farm, and for those families, it was free. By 1917, the value of the antitoxin lab was no longer a debate, and the lab was expanded and given a new name, the Connaught Antitoxin Laboratories and University Farm, or Conitlabs. When the war ended in 1918, the lab's vaccine and treatment practices reduced the rate of tetanus down to 0.1%, making it one of the most successful wartime health campaigns in history. Connaught Labs, in its new and expanded campus off Steeles Avenue in North York, was a powerhouse in public health research and development for the next 50 years. It was ranked with other laboratories like the Pasteur Institute in Paris or the Leicester Institute in London, with the only exception that Connaught was actually still linked to the university and provided excellent opportunities for education, and that it was fully self-funded, despite selling vaccines at cost. In 1921, Connaught Labs was at the center of Canada's most important medical discovery. Frederick Banting and Charles Best were given some space at the lab under the supervision of a Mr. McLeod to do some research on diabetes. Diabetes occurs when the pancreas can't manage the body's sugars, and at the time, it was a death sentence for children who were born with type 1. Researchers already knew that the pancreas made a sort of substance that managed the sugars, and in kids with type 1 diabetes, they knew that that just wasn't happening. But they didn't know what it was. That wasn't until Banting and Best, synonymous here in Canada with the discovery, extracted insulin from a dog and a cow's pancreas. In the following months, they worked with a biochemist from the lab named James Collip to develop an extract that could be safely injected into humans. But the tensions quickly grew between the four partners, and Fitzgerald and Connaught played a key role as a peacemaker between them, and without that, I'm not sure that insulin as we know it would have been developed at that time, and it was a literal lifesaver. The story here goes that during the trials in 1922, they walked into what was essentially a room full of children on their deathbeds in diabetic comas. But when the first was injected with insulin, he woke up and eventually just got up. And so did every other kid in the room. What was a place of mourning became a place of joy in literally minutes. Connaught then set up a plan to produce and distribute insulin across the country and started working with a network of partner labs in other countries to get this world-changing vaccine to communities all across the earth. In the years that followed, Connaught Labs made Canada the leader in vaccine development around the world, and a leader in pushing other medical advances. Charles Best returned to Connaught and he led a program to make a version of heparin, which is a powerful anticoagulant that wouldn't actually kill the patient. This clinical form of heparin, developed in the mid-30s, worked really well to clean up blood clots, and it laid the foundation for surgeries like those on veins and arteries, organ transplants, and open heart surgery to be possible. Then, the Second World War saw the lab ramp up productions for tetanus shots again, adding a typhus vaccine and penicillin to the roster by the end of the war. Preparing all of the Allied soldiers for D-Day, the lab worked 24/7 to get medicines to the front lines. Connaught's practices in research and development created the key material that was required for US researchers to complete their polio vaccine in the 1950s. And while the US supply was interrupted for some time, the Connaught vaccine was proven safe and had no interruptions. Then in the 60s, Connaught played a critical role with the World Health Organization to make the smallpox vaccine available to underserved countries, finally eradicating the disease in 1980. So then, what happened to Connaught Labs? Why is it that this groundbreaking medical facility is not at the forefront of a COVID-19 vaccine? Well, although the building still stands, driving by it today will give you a hint as to what happened. It's no longer owned by the University of Toronto or the Government of Canada, but by a French corporation by the name of Sanofi Pasteur. It all started in the 1970s when the lab was initially sold to the Canada Development Corporation, which was an entity aimed at operating some of the government's more business-like arms, more like a business. But by now, the construction of Canada's public healthcare system was well underway, and the idea that the provinces would provide services to people for free and would seek to reimburse those services at cost was the practice. The labs continued to produce and sell hundreds of thousands of doses of a variety of different vaccines at as little as a fraction of a cent per dose. By 1984, then Prime Minister Brian Mulroney was toying the classic conservative trope that governments can't run businesses like businesses. And regardless of an almost 70-year history of evidence to the contrary, he sold off the Canada Development Corporation in pieces to the highest bidder. And so the laboratory property in North York was sold off, and it has since exchanged hands no less than 6 times in the last 30 years, now landing under the purview of Sanofi Pasteur. Now don't get me wrong, selling one lab wasn't the end of Canada's impressive history of medical research and advancement. In fact, no less than 5 research groups are working on COVID-19 vaccines across the country from Quebec to Saskatchewan, and we continue to pump over $1 billion a year to fund medical research by Canadian scientists at Canadian universities. But if one of those groups did invent even the most powerful, affordable, and effective vaccines, Canada would have to find a producer somewhere else to make it for us. Sanofi Pasteur still does create vaccines out of what they call their Connaught campus in Toronto, but last week's news of Sanofi's COVID-19 vaccine failing its phase 3 testing means that there isn't going to be anything coming out of these gates anytime soon. So Mr. O'Toole, you want to know why we're not making vaccines here in our own country? Don't ask the Prime Minister, ask your predecessor.